Good evening. I'm Sylvia Bashevkin from the University of Toronto. So what kind of conversation is this? My purpose in beginning with such a provocative question is to suggest that we set aside the rather cautious phrase that brings us together, the art of conversation, so that we can confront a series of difficult problems that shape public discourse. In particular, I want to ask how we, as observers and participants in civic debate, grapple with women as holders of public power. My main argument, and it's a contentious one, is the following. The more women leaders we see in positions of national and especially international prominence, the more we seem compelled to either ignore or in some cases demean their contributions. In developing this argument, I will avoid the predictable route of focusing on current events. It would be easy for me to list the many problems that Hillary Rodham Clinton has faced, either in her campaigns for the Democratic presidential nomination or in the current race for the position of U.S. Chief Executive. We could collectively wring our hands over the lamentable reality that a great deal of oxygen has been dedicated since 2008 to the talk about Hillary Clinton's hair, or the state of her marriage, and the question of why she wears pantsuits. We would probably agree very quickly that these various preoccupations have little bearing on her capacity for public leadership. Yet the attention that's been paid to these subjects says a great deal about the profound discomfort that we often feel about the close juxtaposition of women with civic authority. If we embark on a brief journey into the past, we find that the stream of historical research, known as feminist diplomatic historiography, reveals three main patterns in the treatment of women as international leaders since the early modern era. One, lots of women who belong on the historical record are entirely absent from that record. Second, women who are considered are often viewed as underpowered for the positions they hold. And third, if they are not invisible or underpowered, then women leaders are sometimes seen as overpowered for their roles. I want to argue tonight that what all three narratives share is a major unease with the coupling of women and public power. Let's consider each pattern more closely. The first finding from studies of leadership on the international stage reports that women have largely been erased and continue to be erased from grand historical narratives. Their names and faces simply do not appear. In response to this phenomenon, feminist historians have worked to train a spotlight on areas where women did exert visible influence and to try to evaluate how they wielded power. Researchers have thus focused, for example, on informal realms such as family interactions and social networks that were associated with women's salons of the early modern period and later on. Now, researchers have not only showcased these venues as important sites where diplomacy occurred, but they've also demonstrated how over time, the gradual institutionalization of diplomacy restricted women's opportunities. This finding, I want to emphasize, flies in the face of our assumption that the grand march of Western history has made circumstances better in the sense of opening more doors for more women. In particular, scholars have pointed out that a gradual shift away from older, especially dynastic patterns of informal diplomacy toward more scientific and formal and professionalized practices gave prominence to reasoned discussion among men. This process meant that women were systematically squeezed out by the early 20th century from the domain of international relations and consigned, for example, to the status of wives of professional foreign service officers. Hence my question, what kind of conversation is this? If we consider international politics, and especially women's engagement, as leaders of communities that face challenges or threats and may end up going to war, then the answer traditional scholarship usually provides is the following. Only men speak and act. Females are, for the most part, absent or irrelevant. Even if they reach the public podium, their contributions tend to be seen as marginal and unworthy of recognition. A second theme is what I call the underpowered narrative. It can be discerned in older views that women were best prevented from serving as diplomats because they were poorly equipped for international relations and would disrupt international politics. One undersecretary in the British Foreign Office during the interwar years, for example, described appointing women, and I quote, as a deeply distasteful notion that would damage a profession founded on fine masculine qualities, character, integrity, loyalty, and clubbability. End of quote. We find descriptions in popular accounts of women as indecisive and incompetent, as unable to keep order, as meddlesome, vacuous, and too delicate and sentimental for the demands of international negotiation. Now, a third set of narratives suggests women are overpowered for diplomatic work. These perspectives appear in accounts dating from the Renaissance and the Napoleonic periods, and they stress the romantic as well as otherworldly bases of women's closeness to power. Sometimes this overpowered trope appears as a highly sexualized narrative, and it presents women as dangerous sorcerers who conspire with mystics. In other cases, we find suggestions that women are sly tricksters who use feminine wiles to charm and to deceive. Now, if we consider them as a unit, overpowered and underpowered narratives on the historical record since about 1500 serve to demean women's contributions. They not only cast doubt on the suitability of women to diplomatic engagement, but they also impugn women's ability to succeed in any endeavor that demands intellectual rigor, sustained concentration, and balanced judgment. The consequences of these very tropes are worth noting. The implication of neglect is that women don't matter. They are subjects or objects rather than agents who can make history. The message contained in an underpowered narrative is that women who make it onto the historical record are there by mistake, since they lack the right chops. Most intriguing, the overpowered thesis calls out women for being too aggressive, too powerful, and not properly constrained as public actors. With all of these defects dominating the historical record, what kind of contemporary conversation can we have about women in power? I propose that we respond by insisting on seeing and valuing the female bodies that are present on the public stage. We should dedicate our energies not only to refusing to ignore the biases, and rather, we should spend time rebutting conventional interpretations that portray courageous women as unqualified and as inappropriate interlopers in the domain of national as well as international authority. Thank you.